Good afternoon, colleagues. Emina 35, na legislature in Guam is back from recess. Majority Leader, Vice Speaker Nelson, I'm going to recognize you at this time, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to make a motion to rise from the Committee of the Whole.
On that motion, are there any objections? Motion carries. Vice Speaker Nelson, Majority Leader, you are still recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to clarify, the motion that I made was to
Yes.
rise from the Committee of the Whole,
Yes,
and that the motion prior to that was to set aside Bill 255-35.
so motion passes. We will take a moment's recess so that I could go
Thank
on.
you, Madam Chair.
We are in recess. Good afternoon, colleagues, again. Emina 35, na legislature in Guam is back from recess. We have risen. Majority Leader, you are recognized on the report.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just to make it very clear that the motion that I made was to rise from the Committee of the Whole and to set aside Bill number 255-35 to keep it on the agenda for this session. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Situs Masi. Colleagues, we will now entertain Bill 214-35 LS. Senator Mary Torres, you are recognized.
Situs Masi. First, I'd like to move to accept Bill number 214-35LS as substituted on the floor. Introduced by myself, this bill is an act to add a new Article 5 to Chapter 48 of Title 21, Guam Code Annotated, relative to providing lease protections for tenants who are victims of family violence, criminal sexual conduct, or stalking, and to further citing this act as the Guam Safe Housing Act of 2020. Madam Chair, a copy of the substitute measure has been provided to members by our directory, and I've also included a list that outlines the changes that were made to the bill for the body's convenience.
Thank you, Senator Torres. On the motion to accept, are there any objections? Hearing none, seeing none, motion carries. Senator Mary Torres, you are still recognized.
Thank you. I further move to place into the third reading file Bill number 214-35LS as substituted on the floor. And if I may speak on the measure further?
Senator Torres, you may proceed.
Okay. Madam Speaker, I introduced Bill 214 last October to address some of the challenges that victims of violence face when accessing and maintaining safe housing. Given the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe these challenges have grown. As my colleagues are aware, almost every state in response to the coronavirus outbreak implemented shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders. And while to us this simply meant remaining indoors, for far too many victims, a stay-at-home order meant being confined with the person that was harming them. Since then, several domestic violence service providers and organizations have reported an increase in cases nationally. Although we haven't yet witnessed a surge on Guam, local experts have warned that our island should prepare for a similar rise as a result of this pandemic. For example, in an April conference hosted by the Guam Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence, Judge Arthur Barcina stated in part, and I'm quoting from his statements, "Being forced to stay indoors is oftentimes the nightmare that the environment for domestic violence and sexual assault. Ironically, our response to the crisis sets up the perfect condition and environment for increased abuse in all of its forms: physical, psychological, sexual, verbal, and financial abuse, making it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for victims to get the help that they need as a result of isolation from family, friends, and access to services." He further notes and emphasizes that we should expect an increase in not just the number of cases, but perhaps more importantly, an escalation in the degree of violence brought on as a result of increased pressures brought about by this crisis, to include lost jobs and the cascading effects of major financial pressures, and the uncertainty following the lifting of the social isolation. In response to some of these financial pressures, Bill 214 would allow victim tenants to terminate their rental agreements early without suffering legal or financial consequences. This is necessary, Madam Speaker, because right now, under our current Guam law, a landlord is entitled to recover actual damages and obtain injunctive relief against a tenant for non-compliance with the rental agreement. There's also nothing in our Landlord-Tenant Act that against retaliation and discrimination. While GORA offers some protections to domestic violence victims, its provisions are limited to those that are living only in HUD housing. This bill would cover everyone. As evidence of victimization, the bill requires tenants to provide a police report or a restraining or protective order, among other documents. To protect landlords, The bill also makes clear that if a tenant knowingly submits false notice or documentation, the landlord may recover an amount equal to 3 months' periodic rent or threefold actual damages, whichever is greater, plus cost and reasonable attorney's fees. In closing, Madam Speaker, Bill 214 simply recognizes what so many of our states have already done. And it is my hope that with the explicit protections built into our Landlord-Tenant Act, this body sends a clear message to Guam's victims that no survivor should have to stay in an abusive situation just because they can't afford to move out. Situs Maasi.
Buen Pobetsu, Senator Mary Torres. On the main amendment, Minority Leader, you are recognized.
Just a point of inquiry, Madam Speaker.
State your question.
The part that's on the online right now, the substituted version, was it said that any changes that were made were double underlined or anything like that? Because I'm looking to see if where the changes are. And just, Madam Speaker, just to verify that the substitute version is SB 214 outline of changes, or no, I didn't quite understand what was said. Was it double underlined to show the changes made to the?
I'll have Senator Torres restate that. Senator Torres, your substituted version.
Madam Chair, as we are aware, this bill is a substitute bill.
Right.
And what this bill does is it creates a new Article 5
Right.
to Title 21. So everything in the bill is on there. If the question is what is the changes from this one versus the one that was introduced, there is a separate document that contains, that is called Outline of Changes in the Zoom drive. So that just has the three main areas, very minor changes between the introduced bill and this one.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Minority Leader? Well, that suffices.
Yeah, it's just a little bit different. Usually there's a double underline, and now we're looking at a separate paper. So I'm just going to take a moment to look at that separate document. Thank you.
Vice Speaker Nelson on the main motion.
Thank you, Madam. Sorry. Test. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of this measure. And I also am greatly appreciative to the sponsor of this amendment for providing us an outline document that shows the changes that was made prior to the substituted version on the floor. And so just to reiterate some of the changes that was made in the substitute bill 214-35, there was a removal of language permitting the landlord to hold security deposits. And this ensures landlords being able to receive full month's rent, and that the sponsor recognizes that for many tenants, a security deposit is the difference between staying and leaving. And a hold may unintentionally tie a victim to their agreement, financially strapping them to their abusive situation. And so in the Landlord-Tenant Act, we gave the landlords the authority to hold on to security deposits should they renege on their lease or the contract that they are renting the unit from. And so this is essentially removing that for the victim and allowing the victim to find another place to stay in the event that their abuser, if they're in the event that they're unable to perhaps find another location where their abuser is still continuing to remain in the household, or the abuser is still continuing to visit the place of their residence. And there's also language adding, providing a lock change option, and references to sexual assault to criminal sexual conduct, and then the updated reference of 2019 to 2020. So, Madam Speaker, this is a very thorough outline of the substituted version. This is the first time I've ever seen this thoroughness for a substituted bill given to our colleagues, so I'd like to thank the sponsor for that. And Madam Speaker, I'd like to rise in support of this measure. Last term, we passed the Landlord-Tenant Act, which was not updated for the past 30 years, and so the legislature at that time passed, the 34th legislature passed the Landlord-Tenant Act to update it to the current situations that we are facing today. And in this measure, the Safe Housing Act is really in favor for those that are suffering abuse from their spouse or their significant other, or even people that are in abusive relationships, whether it be sexually, verbally, or even physical abuse. And Madam Speaker, it shows a lot of wisdom that the sponsor had to really understand the struggles that our society faces, that our community faces, sufferings that we don't even like to speak about because perhaps of the embarrassment or the fear of the abuse continuing onto them, and perhaps even lacking the courage because of constant abuse. You start to doubt yourself. You start to feel like you're alone. You start to feel helpless. And really, this bill is providing this helping hand from the legislature, saying, we understand that there's this suffering going on, and we're going to talk about it. We're not going to pretend like it doesn't exist. And so I'm really grateful for this bill, because these are things we do need to talk about as a community. These are things that we need to recognize, really, to see where our island is suffering. And there are many, 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 many cases of abuse in the household, and we don't like to talk about it often. And we don't even know what solutions we can provide, even when we address the issue. And so this is a very concrete solution, a concrete help, a hand to those that are suffering, saying, you are not alone, that we stand with you, and we will create policies and laws to protect you. And this bill contains so much wisdom and compassion in it of itself, and I'm very grateful for the sponsor for this bill. And God bless her. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
You're very welcome, Vice Speaker Nelson. Core Chair Senator Regine Biscolia will recognize you on the main motion.
Sudos Masi, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I too rise in support of Bill 214, and I want to thank the author for introducing it. Also, if you review the committee report thoroughly, Madam Speaker, in her remarks during the public hearing, the author did mention that there were a few amendments that would be made to the bill. And so one of those possible amendments, as the retiring speaker was mentioning, was the amendment of the landlord holding on to the security deposit, which would potentially create a financial inability for victims of abuse to leave an abusive situation. And so I certainly appreciate the transparency, letting this body and the public know what amendments were being contemplated, and then taking it a step further and placing it in our Google Drive, just outlining all of the different changes. And I appreciate that those things were made available to us prior to session, so that we could review those things, and then it's all in the committee report. I appreciate that being available online as well. Madam Speaker, the Public Defender Services Corporation also provided testimony on this bill, and they made mention that this bill addresses one of the barriers that victims face, and that's housing. And I'd like to just read into the record this testimony, because I think it's important for our colleagues to hear. And Attorney Hattori had mentioned that far too often homelessness is the situation, or is the solution for leaving an abusive relationship, homelessness. And victims often hide in the shadows. They're afraid to ask for help because of a fear that they may lose their housing. Others are trapped in an abusive relationship tied to an abuser by a year-long lease. The fear of being financially tied to a long-term lease should not impede one's fight from abuse. The law would permit such a victim to seek early termination of the lease agreement. This law, too, would protect the victim from paying any damage caused by the abuser. Madam Speaker, it's really important for us to, when we introduce our bills, we have the opportunity for the public to provide testimony, but to really listen to the voice of the people and to listen to the voices of people like Attorney Hattori, who speak for those in our community who are suffering this kind of abuse. And Madam Speaker, I agree with the author of this bill that passage of this bill would send a very clear message to those survivors in our community that we support them and that we are thinking of ways to assist them to be free from some of these situations that are really holding them back from living their lives, Madam Speaker. And so I certainly rise in support of this measure, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. Situs Masi.
Situs Masi, Senator Lee. Minority Leader, you are recognized on the main motion.
Sujus Masi, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I attended the public hearing and for this legislation. The author of the bill wasn't present at the time. I had a question that I wanted to ask, and that had to do with the damages caused by those involved or the tenants that are staying at the residence. And this was after speaking to some of the realtors and people actually who rent out apartments and homes to individuals. Many of them are very aware of situations like that that's beyond the victim's control of an individual. I mean, in fact, Madam Speaker, just recently we saw on social media what family violence can actually do with the recently, and the videotaping of the pickup truck hitting into another truck, and it was all due to family violence. So there definitely is a problem here on Guam, and it's very unfortunate. And this legislation will help correct some of that and put some of those at ease who, when it's not their fault, or don't lean toward any kind of violence or anything and try to reason, but when the other party doesn't. But what happens here is when it says in here the legislation, the question I wanted to ask, and maybe if the author can answer, in the event that there's a domestic occurrence in a residence, and the individual is then finally kicked out, but the damages that are caused, sometimes they will say that I'm not responsible for it, it's somebody else, but yet the victim will not testify in court that this individual is the one that broke the door, crushed the cabinets, did all this other stuff. And yet the victim is too afraid to go into court to testify that they did it, because this is the only way for the landlord to be able to recover damages, by taking that individual to small claims court. So that's my concern, is that how do we ensure, is there something in this legislation that requires the victim to at least testify or put an affidavit in place to ensure that the landlord at least has a means to go after the individual who damaged the property?
Senator Chadwick, you would like an answer from the author of the
Yes,
legislation?
please.
Senator Torres, would you like to yield to that inquiry from the Minority Leader?
Certainly. I'd like to refer everybody to page 4 of the bill under section 48502. where it has protection against eviction and liability. What this bill contemplates is while a victim under B, while a victim shall not be held liable for damage to the property related to an incident or incidents of actual damage beyond the value of the victim's security deposit when the alleged perpetrator is a tenant and the victim provides written notice of damage documentation within 30 days. We are asserting here, this bill under this section gives a victim the release of liability from damages, but it goes further on C, subsection C, that C and D, actually C, D, and E. C, D, and E then spells out what the protections are for the landlord. The landlord certainly can take action against the perpetrator who caused damage. If you look at C, well, I'm sorry, let's go to D. There's nothing to prohibit the landlord from instituting forcible entry or detainer actions against the tenant who perpetuated the family violence, or to obtain a no trespass order. Under E, nothing in this act limits the rights of the landlord to hold a perpetrator of the family violence, criminal sexual conduct, or stalking liable for damage to the premises or the landlord's property. So this here gives the landlord the protection that yes, they can and will seek a cause of action. And all that's really required is for the tenant to provide that notice to the landlord of what those damages are. What I don't want to get into is to prescribe to the court how they should conduct their proceedings when there is a claim in the court, a claim for damages. That is up to the court if they want to subpoena the victim. That's their prerogative. If they want to, just depose the perpetrator, that's their prerogative. But I just believe that in terms of the landlord having remedies under this law, it is absolutely provided here that although the victim won't be held liable for damages that somebody else did, there's nothing to prevent him from going after that person to seek recovery and payment of the damages. I hope I answered the question. I don't know if the question is that I should compel someone to appear in court. I think that's beyond what this act is intended to do. In terms of interfering in court proceedings, I'm not going to mandate that here.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Minority Leader, you're still recognized.
Okay, so my concern, and as the author was reading these areas, especially in sections where it says, C, where it says unrelated to family violence, criminal sexual conduct, so the landlord prohibits any kind of eviction of the tenant for reasons unrelated to family violence, so that went to it. So nothing in this act prohibits the landlord from instituting a forcible entry. Okay, that's just entry or obtaining, that's just going into the residence. But what I'm trying to get out, and maybe
Minority
there
Leader?
is something with regards to,
If I may, Minority Leader, I'm going to take a moment's recess just based on the inquiry that's said. I'm going to ask legal counsel for an interpretation, so
Thank you.
we're in a moment's recess.
Thank you.
Imina 35 na legislatura in Guahan is back from session. Minority Leader, I will recognize you just to finish on your statement.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And
thank you for the opportunity to speak to legal counsel. As I mentioned, it was several real estate agents as well as individuals who owned property that were renting out. They're concerned about this. And after speaking with legal and coming to the conclusion that the remedy here is that the victim has 30 days in order to fill out any kind of documentation on what transpired. But then again, once that is completed, if she doesn't or he doesn't within 30 days, then the onus stays on the tenant. However, moving forward, in the event the landlord needs to recover, like could be $4,000 worth of damages, then the individual will go to small claims through a remedy of small claims. However, once it gets there, it gets kind of sticky again, Madam Speaker, because then the individual that's being sued for damages can actually say, no, I didn't do it, she did it, or he did it. And then it gets kind of messy in that situation. He said, she said, but I'm comfortable with this so far, and I think that the process, hopefully, and justice will prevail in every way and manner. But thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for allowing me to seek legal advice on this as well. I appreciate it. It's important that we do that. Thank you.
you're very welcome, Minority Leader. Anyone else on the main motion? Senator Joe San Augustine, I'll recognize you on the main motion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleagues, today we have a chance to offer assistance in healing for our vulnerable victims of abuse and violence. Bill 214 is a measure that offers the victims of this violence, the tenant, and the landlord with a safety net to overcome the emotional and physical harms that come from the abusive act. The bill is not to take away from the rights of landlords, but to help in protecting victims of abuse, to include children, and should there be any landlords among us, I respectfully suggest that you recuse yourself from any discussion and vote on this bill in order to prevent any conflict of interest. This bill is long overdue, and I stand in support of Bill 214, making it work for all interested parties. And I thank the author for her foresight with this bill. Zeus Masi, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Senator Torres, for your bill.
Buen provecho, Senator Joe San Augustine. Anybody else on the main motion? Senator Kelly Marsh Teichno, you are recognized.
Sejus Maasi, Madam Speaker. I too rise in support of this bill. This bill is very thoughtful, and as one reads through it, we can see the many layers of thoughtfulness there. It has anti-discrimination and retaliation section. It has disclosure prohibitions for the landlords, that they do not disclose any of the information that is provided to them by the tenant. It has a section where the tenant, in order to validate and make these claims, has to provide very important evidence. And so with the evidence, one has to get either excuse me, let me find that. One has to get either a restraining order to be able to show a restraining order, or a written note from a doctor, or a police report. And so, again, these show those many layers. And as has been mentioned, for the landlords, there has also been thoughtfulness there for the landlords. To make sure that if there are false claims, that the landlord is protected from false claims. And so one of the things is with these verifiable instruments of pieces of evidence, if these prove to not be carrying out the case, then there are penalties to really keep this bill at its true intent, and that's safeguarding the victims here of various types of abuse or harm, including stalking. So with that, I also want to mention that the new version, the substituted version, I think it was a very good addition to put in that there is a lock change option. So while the bill was already working towards saving the victims, some of these things, such as moves, relocation, can be very difficult and very daunting. And here, with the lock change option, it can become a much more affordable and feasible in certain circumstances situation to be safeguarding them. So it gives them options. So again, I think that it was very thoughtful. It tried to be extremely thorough. It tried to look at the victims and safeguarding them, as well as any of those in the family that might be suffering from a situation, but also for the landlords, really trying to give the landlords tools to be able to recuperate damages to the best of their ability, as well as other protections for them. And I do like the way that the retiring speaker mentioned it. It allows the landlord to be part of the solution of safeguarding victims. Sejus Masi.
Buen provecho, Senator Taitsino. Anyone else on the main motion? Anyone else? Senator Therese Terlaye, you recognize.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I also stand in support of this bill. I want to thank the sponsor for offering this measure. Ensuring that victims of domestic violence are protected, of course, has been a goal of our entire community. However, it remains a huge challenge. It's not something that we have overcome despite years and despite increasing knowledge and laws that we have passed. It still is quite prevalent and very dangerous. And so I am very much hoping that this bill and the protections that it offers for housing, that victims will hear about it, that we can, make it loud, and that they will hear about it wherever they are and know that there is some type of protection that they can seek. One of the biggest challenges that they face is that it's really debilitating in many cases, fear of living independent financially from the perpetrator, because they've never done that. And so when I was a very young lawyer, that was I was so proud to be a lawyer and being home and being able to help, victims of domestic violence. However, it was a very rude awakening for me to find that that is one of the biggest obstacles, is this of course, they cannot be financially independent immediately, and convincing them that we have services that can help them, take care of them, despite the huge dedication of people like the Ali Shelter and Catholic Social Services, the courts, the victims advocates. Despite all of these, it still is, it's a barrier. And so that was the rude awakening for me as a very young lawyer, to find that that is, and I think it's still the case today, Madam Speaker, in speaking with the victims advocates, that convincing victims to truly leave perpetrators of domestic violence, you have to convince them that they are going to be financially okay, especially when they have children. And so it's my great hope that this bill will, that they will hear about it and that they will know that there is protection. We actually do have federal laws that help. They require public housing authorities to, protect victims of domestic violence. We actually, I know that the Homeless Coalition has been very good about seeking these grants that have been given to GURA to house on an emergency basis those people who have become homeless because of domestic violence. So they are working very hard to use every resource available to them to physically find housing when necessary. So this bill, it will expand what we have in place today, and it will, in places where victims already have a rental unit, it will allow the victims to terminate their agreement early without being penalized for the rest of the lease. It would require proof. They don't necessarily have to go to court, which is maybe very helpful, because getting to court, again, is a huge barrier. We still need a lot more lawyers who will take these types of cases. So this will allow them with providing a police report, that's enough evidence, or a restraining or protective order, which you have to get at court, or a written statement from a licensed medical professional as evidence of victimization. And I think legal had recommended that in addition to a medical professional, that we might want to add a victim's advocate instead, because not all crimes, such as stalking, are you going to have a physical, something for a physical doctor to evaluate. And so they had recommended victim's advocate, and I was going to ask the sponsor if she would yield if there was a reason we don't want to include victim's advocate, or if she would be open to that.
Would you like to yield?
I'm sorry, I'm on page 4 of the sub-bill. I think it's item number 3 in the very top, B3. This is the evidence that can be provided as evidence that a tenant is a victim. So they're going to show this evidence to the landlord.
Yes, I'll yield to the question. It is very possible that when we were thinking about how to cover all the areas and how to have somebody that is in a professional capacity or in a capacity of authority to provide a statement, the idea was if there was some physical harm, a medical person, or if there was some counseling, a mental health professional. If the good senator wants to add that as a third tier, I mean, the expectation there is that the person providing the statement will be someone who is licensed or has some official capacity to represent. So I don't think that that's adverse. I think that that actually might be a good idea. But I would have to ask her to, if we put that into qualify, how we can establish that that person is, has an official capacity or has some recognized license or certification. Because the idea here is to avoid fraud.
Oh, no, I agree with the bill it currently has been substituted to read that one of the evidence could be from a licensed medical or mental health professional. Yeah, so my inquiry was only about a victim's advocate, or evidence from a victim's advocate as another alternative. I think I was just a victim's advocate or service provider. But I'll leave that for now, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much to the sponsor. But I totally agree with the other 3 potential types of evidence. The bill releases the tenant from any rent payment obligation beyond 1 month. And my understanding is that the courts are also doing this. So in addition to the federal protections that are in place, the grants that we might have that our nonprofits are using to physically help victims find housing, that the courts are also on a case-by-case, they are dealing with this. And if you get to court and they can give you a protective order, they might also, in protecting you and your space, allowing you to stay in the unit, they are also, doing very similar things. But this bill is unique because it would allow this to be done without going to court with these evidence provided to the landlord. So in short, yes, I support the bill, Madam Speaker, and I know that homelessness is a real threat on Guam for many people, not just victims. It is exacerbated for victims, of course, because sometimes it's a situation beyond their control. And under these pandemic times, it has become exacerbated for almost everyone on Guam, or at least thousands of people who have lost their jobs, and our time limits on these moratoriums and other things are coming to an end, Madam Speaker, and they are all seeking help from all of us. And I know that the federal government has tried to, address this through CARES funding to the states to allow us to utilize it for housing assistance and homelessness. And so I'm also hoping that that will also be further looked at by our government, Madam Speaker, on an immediate basis. I think they keep talking about they're addressing the homelessness issue with the CARES Act funding, but I think we can look at more of this just to expand for many more people. Situs Masi.
Buen provecho, Senator Teresa Ryan. Anybody else on the main motion? If not, Senator Torres, would you like to close?
Yes, I would. I'd like to, first, before I do make my closing remarks, I'd like to move to add Talina Cruz Nelson as a co-sponsor and Speaker Barnes and Regine Bisco Lee as co-sponsors of this bill.
On that motion, are there any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Senator Torres, you may proceed.
Yes, I want to thank my colleagues for their sensitivity to this very delicate issue. In fact, one of the testimonies provided at the public hearing was that this bill will now enable, having this in our statute, will enable us to apply for additional grant monies under the Violence Against Women's Act. And that Violence Against Women's Act is what they also provide guidelines to tenants that are currently in the federal housing, like GORA housing, HUD. But what we're also dealing with is a growing trend where 27 states across the nation have also built into their laws these early lease terminations for survivors. And we note survivors. We want to make sure also that every landlord, of course, there's always an interest to protect their investments. But I think the overriding interest here is the interest in protecting lives and families who suffer from victimization. And with that, we also try to be very sensitive to the landlord's rights and the landlord's needs to protect their property. So I think this bill was a good balance for that. This bill also is going to be consistent with 24 other states that provide defenses against evictions, discrimination against evictions. And because the nature of victimization and their cases are very sensitive, we also now will join 44 other states and localities that have laws pertaining to confidentiality of housing records and the documentation of victims. But I think that it was very important to address this, Madam Speaker, not only in the time of COVID when tensions are escalating, but especially because, regretfully, we are in a situation on Guam where the second highest number of cases recorded in the courts are domestic violence. And across the nation, we rank second in sexual assault cases. So Guam has a lot of challenges, and as much as we can do to provide protections or opportunities for people to escape, that is our challenge, I believe. So I'd just like to thank everyone for their support, and I look forward to this becoming statute and part of the Landlord-Tenant Act. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Torres. So can you put the motion?
Thank you, and I move to place this on the third reading file.
On that motion to place on the voting file, are there any objections? Seeing or hearing what? None. Motion carries. I'm going to address Senator Moylan at this time on Bill 71. Senator Moylan, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time for Bill 71, I wish to request to put aside Bill 71-35, and if I can briefly explain, Madam Speaker.
Motion to set aside. Are there any objections?
He's going to explain why?
Se-
Sorry?
Senator Moylan, there was a request to, why do you want to set the bill aside? And I understand you're working on some information with DPW. Please explain.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Since this bill has made it to the agenda, additional helpful information has come up, which the Director of DPW is very interested in learning more of. So in further discussion with the Director of DPW and the committee as well, we find it in the best interest to request that this 7135 be put aside for now. Kindly. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. On the motion to set aside, are there any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Majority Leader, Vice Speaker Nelson, can I recognize you at this time?
Just Madam Speaker, I'd like to make the motion that we recess till tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.
On the motion to recess at 10 a.m., without any objection, motion carries. We are in recess till 10 a.m. Please be safe, colleagues.